How's everybody? Everyone doing okay? We doing all right? Everyone alive, well, safe, healthy? All right, good. So basically we're just going to continue what we did last time, and what that means, the plan for today, we're going to start off, I'm just going to do a little more on why the hell are we here and why is this a class. Then we're going to go over the homework, and we're going to go through all of them, and I'm going to highlight a few things. On the whole, again, I was happy with the homework. Some of them I didn't word as well as I could have, so I was, again, pretty lenient on it, and I'm going to highlight some key ideas that came through in the homework and things I just want to talk about a little more. And then we're going to transition to talking about more complicated arguments and just looking at multi-step arguments and things like that, because those are really the ones you're going to encounter in your everyday life. And then we're going to finish off the class by talking about hidden premises, what they are, why they're worth talking about, why it's important. So just a little reminder, why the hell are we here? Why is this a class? Why do you get credit for it? And so basically, again, the main thing of this class is critical thinking or critical reasoning. And all that means is thinking about thinking. And why are we doing it? Well, because the better you are at thinking about thinking, and the better you are at thinking, the less likely you are to get tricked by other people, the better you are going to be at persuading people, the better you are at going to be making decisions in your own life that are good for you and your family. So it's really, this is almost like a training class of training you how to think. So what that means is you need to be able to tell good arguments and bad arguments and what go into those quickly and effectively. Because if you have to spend all day thinking through things, it's exhausting. And very often then we just go with our gut feelings, and oftentimes our guts aren't that smart. They get things wrong. So basically, all we want to do is make sure that if our goal is to convince ourselves to do something or to convince others to do it, we want to make sure we're doing that well. And the way we do it well, the way we make sure that the conclusions we reach or the decisions we make are good ones, is that we do things in a good way or the right way. And so all that, all these fancy terms mean are basically, am I going to get to a good conclusion if I go about things in the right way? So all these fancy terms from the homework, things like cogent, valid, sound, all that is just fancy ways of saying, if I think about things in this way, am I going to get a good answer? Or if I do things in the right way, am I going to get to a conclusion that will allow me to live happily and not do dumb things? And so that's why the hell we're here. And with that background of all that stuff, now what I'm going to do is just talk about some of the fancy terms we came across in the homework and talk about how they plug in. So basically, the way we used this big fancy term last class, and I introduced you all to it, and the big words were deductive and inductive. But really, even though we've got these big words, all you really need to think of these as is two different ways where if you think along these lines, you're guaranteed to reach a conclusion that you are going to be able to use in your everyday life to succeed and do well. So these are just fancy terms for thinking in a way that you're guaranteed to get a good answer. And so there's two different ways to get a good answer, or to reach a conclusion that's true or very likely to be true or very likely to help you get around in your everyday life. And these are things which we run across in our everyday life. One way in which you test to see, should I do this thing or is this a good idea, is you just look at what you've done in your past and what the outcomes were, or you look at what's happened before. And so that's all an inductive argument is. Inductive is just a really fancy way of using the past to make predictions about the future. And we all do it all the time. You know, why did you know not to go to McDonald's at 3 in the morning? Well, you know from experience they're closed. Or why did you know that if the person on the subway was shouting loudly, you should walk away from them? Well, you have experience that tells you if people are shouting loudly on the subway, they're generally not someone you want to be next to. Things could get a little uncomfortable. So that's all it means to think inductively. And so on the flip side, deductively, oh, actually, let me finish with inductively. In your everyday life, when you're thinking about, should I go about things in a good way or a bad way? Or like, if I should use my past experience to draw conclusions about the future, what sorts of past experiences are good ones and what sorts of past experiences are bad ones? So if you're trying to say, I should do this thing because of what's come before, what's the number one factor determining whether you think it's a good Like if you're trying to draw on things in the past, what are the things that you take into consideration when deciding, yeah, you know what, this is a situation in which I should use past experience? Anyone have any thoughts? Just while I can grab a drink of water, what is the main thing that you use? Like when you're trying to decide, like, you know what, in the past I did things this way, so I should do it again. What are the main things that people take into account?
I think like you can, like, for example, if one thing happened like once or twice, like you can't guarantee that it's gonna happen again. But if it happened like all the time, like every time the same thing happens, then yeah, then you should take it into consideration. But if it's only like a few times, I don't think.
You're spot on. Eliana's point is great. And what you just described is that big, stupid, fancy word cogent. That word which came up in the homework. To say something is cogent, all you're saying is that it's something that you have a lot of different experiences suggesting it. So if you were to come across someone and they were like, you know what, I think the sun's gonna rise tomorrow. And you're like, well, why do you think the sun's gonna rise tomorrow? And they say, well, it rose yesterday and today and the day before yesterday, and they list off every single day. That's really good reason to think it's gonna happen again, because just the way the world works, things generally happen in patterns. If there's no reason to think the sun's gonna blow up, then the fact that the sun's risen every single day is pretty damn good evidence it's gonna rise again tomorrow. If, however, on the flip side, you have somebody who's like, you know what? I have a feeling I'm gonna get hit by a car today. And you're like, what is your evidence that you're gonna get hit by a car today? And their evidence is just, well, I knew someone once who got hit by a car like 6 years ago. You're like, well, that's not evidence. That's not cogent. There's no pattern here that you once knew someone who got hit by a car. That's not reason to think you're gonna get hit by a car. So all inductive reasoning is, it's just a fancy way of saying using past experience to draw conclusions about the future or about the present. And good inductive reasoning is just the more particular cases you can point to. So you look at particular examples from the past, and the more particular examples you come up with, the better the reasoning. So that's all good inductive reasoning is just look at more cases. So if you want to know whether a certain breed of dog is good, don't meet one of them, meet 7,000. And if you met 7,000 and they're all really nice, then the 7,001st is probably going to be nice too. That's all inductive or cogent inductive reasoning is, and that's all inductive reasoning is. It's just, and this is this unfortunate thing that philosophers do. It's probably because we like to make ourselves feel good and like we have a purpose in the world, but we use unnecessarily big words sometimes. All inductive is just using past to draw conclusions about the future. That's all it is. And so, deductive on the flip side. And remember, the reason we do inductive reasoning is the goal is to get a conclusion that is likely to be true. Because you want to know, should I do this thing? What will happen if I do it? I want to predict before it happens. If I want to know, is it going to hurt if I stab myself this time? Well, you look at past experiences, and if every other time it's hurt, it's probably going to hurt this time. So it's just trying to find out what I should do. Or if you've got a friend who every other time you try to set up dinner with them, they flake on you, and you're trying to decide, should I set up dinner again? Should I waste my time planning this thing? And the last 100 times they've never shown up, you have good reason to think they're not going to show up this time, and I shouldn't bother planning it, even if it's their birthday. So that's all it is to reason inductively. Now, deductive reasoning. I think that the best way to think about what deductive reasoning is, or what a deductive argument is think of it like a recipe when you're cooking. What is the point of a recipe? Feel free to type it in the chat. Feel free to say it out loud. Feel free to just stare at the screen. Any of the above will work. But just why do we use recipes? What is the point of them? What do they do for us?
A guide.
So yeah, William's right. They guide you. Tajari, did you want to add on?
I was just about to say basically the same thing, a guide.
Yeah, the idea is they guide you. They tell you what to do. And the point of a recipe is a recipe, if you follow a recipe, so Aaron's correct. Yeah, they're the steps to make something. They give you a step-by-step guide of how to do things. Now, if you follow a recipe, are you guaranteed to end up with something that tastes good?
We're guaranteed to end up something that the recipe says.
Yeah, so one is you're guaranteed to end up something that the recipe thinks is good. But even then, like it might not taste good. So what if I follow the instructions perfectly? I do everything it says, and I like this sort of food. Say I'm making a new like pasta dish or something, and I really like this sort of stuff, and it ends up tasting like crap. What might have happened? What might have gone wrong? Assume that I'm not in, I mean, I'm a halfway decent cook, but imagine that I didn't do anything wrong. I followed the instructions perfectly. What else might have gone wrong? Say it calls for tomatoes. And the way I get these tomatoes is I go into the garbage can down the block and I dig them out. And these tomatoes are like 6 days old. There's cockroaches climbing out of them. They smell funny. They were right next to, you know, like the decaying body of my neighbor. Like, why is this meal going to taste bad? Well, it's not because the recipe's bad. It's not because I didn't follow the recipe. It's rather because my ingredients sucked. And so in the same way, what you can think of a deductive argument as is it's like a recipe. It tells you that if you start with good ingredients and you follow along with these rules, you're guaranteed to get something that is good. In this case, something that is true. Now, that's not a guarantee that you're always going to get a true answer, because just like with a recipe, if you start with crappy ingredients, you're going to end up with a crappy answer. But like a recipe, where if you take the recipe and you follow it, let's assume it's a good recipe. If it's a good recipe and you follow it and you started with good ingredients, you're guaranteed to end up with a good outcome. And so this sort of idea here is just what it means when we're talking about validity. A deductive argument is just a step-by-step instructions of how to take some things which you believe and draw more conclusions from them. So it tells you how to take thing like premise 1 and premise 2, combine them together to get another conclusion, something else. And if you follow the steps right, and because it's a valid deductive argument, and you begin with true premises, you're guaranteed to get a true answer. So that's all a deductive argument is you can think of it as a recipe for your mind. Take one thing you think is true, take another thing that you think is true, and you're guaranteed taking them together to get another thing which you know is true, and you could then use that. So if I know that I want to go to Grand Central, and I know that the 4 train runs to Grand Central, then conclusion, I can take the 4 train to Grand Central. I don't have to do anything else. I know that as long as 1 is true and 2 is true, I'm guaranteed to be able to take the 4 train to Grand Central. So that's all that you can. So when you're thinking about a deductive argument, think of it as a recipe. Is this a thing which I can take some things I already believe and learn new things that I should also believe? And a non-valid argument is one that in the same way as a bad recipe, even if you follow it, you're not guaranteed to get a good outcome. So if you get a recipe that says something like, I don't know, throw in some flour, then add some sugar maybe, I don't know, beets, I like those, they're purple. Like, this is not a good recipe, because even if you follow it perfectly and start with the best ingredients, it's going to end up crappy. So you can think of the deductive, a valid deductive argument is like a good recipe, where if you follow the instructions, you begin with good ingredients, you're going to end up with good food. An invalid argument is one where even if you start with the best ingredients, if you follow them, you still might end up with something crappy. And so that's all you need to, like, that's the background for just like what these were. So with this in mind, I just want to go over the homework a little bit more. But does anyone have any questions at this point? Are we doing all right? Okay. And again, the whole point of this is just so we can get in our everyday lives, be better at thinking. So the homework. The first question, the Old Town Road question. Over the past 87 Mondays, my grandma has sung Old Town Road as she ate breakfast. It's Monday. Therefore, grandma is going to sing Old Town Road at breakfast. First off, is this an argument? It is. William's nodding his head. Yes, it is an argument. And then is it inductive or deductive? And now just to summarize, given what I just said, in this particular case, is this somebody looking at past experiences and going, on these past experiences, can I use that as good reason to draw a conclusion about the future? Or is it a case in which a person is taking things they already believe and combining them together like a recipe to get something else? So which one is it?
Inductive.
Yeah, it's inductive. It's the using past experience. Thank you, Megan. That's spot on. It's using past experience to draw a conclusion about the future. So yes, this one was inductive. Now, number 2 is, as it's technically written, it's inductive. However, if you said deductive on this, you also got full credit because I realized it was very poorly worded. And this kind of highlights something here where I said every time in my life that I've eaten cheese pizza. It suggests what I should have said is every time in the past that I've eaten cheese pizza. Because I wasn't clear about that, you could also read this as every time in my life that I will ever eat cheese pizza, I will get a stomach ache. And if that's the case, it's a universal claim. And from there, it's going to be deductive. So basically for this one, as long as you didn't say as long as you didn't say it's not an argument, you got full credit. The first one was cogent because it's 87 Mondays, a pretty good case. Grandma's probably not going to stop singing. And this one, it's if you said it was deductive, it was valid. If you said it was inductive, then it was cogent. So that was that one. All right. Number 3 tricked some people. And this is one I definitely want to highlight a little bit more. So first off, was number 3 inductive or deductive or not neither? Anyone know?
Deductive?
It was deductive, David. Yeah, so number 3 was deductive. Now, where people lost points a lot of times was the question of, is it valid? And so this is a really good point to highlight what makes something valid. So again, the definition of valid is if you start with true premises, are you guaranteed to get a true conclusion? In the same way of a good recipe is if you start with good ingredients, are you guaranteed to get something good? And so a lot of people said, yes, this is valid, but it is not valid. And the reason why is, remember, to be valid is if A is true and B is true, then the conclusion has to follow. So in this case, we have all dogs have teeth and I have teeth. Conclusion, I'm a dog. So the way you figure out whether it's valid or not is you assume this one's true and assume this one's true, and then see if you can think of a case in which, even though these are both true, this one could be false. And this is the best way to test for validity. See if you can think of a counterexample to it. So if we're making a claim, all dogs have teeth, and I have teeth, can we think of a case in which, even though all dogs have teeth, let's assume all dogs had teeth, and we assume that I have teeth, can we think of a counterexample to the claim that I'm a dog?
There are other animals that have teeth?
Yeah, one of them is me. Like, look, I got teeth. I've got teeth, but I'm not a dog. Therefore, this is showing that this is not a valid conclusion. It's not valid because even if this is true and this is true, it's still possible for this to be false. Namely, like, I actually am not a dog, unfortunately. I feel like life is simpler for dogs. Like, I always look at them when it's like wintertime and I have to leave the house. It's like, oh, you get to sit here by a heating pad or like by a radiator and just sit there and stay warm. But yeah, this is a case in which it's not valid. So what I wanted to do here is just put up, as I said, the best way to identify whether an argument is valid is see if you can think of a case in which the premises are true and the conclusion is false. And this is where the thinking kicks in. You're going to have to get a little imaginative. But basically, and this is where a lot of the skill of critical reasoning comes in, is being able to assess whether, in this particular case, it's a good argument. But there are generally some patterns which reasoning can take, which allows you, like, if you recognize anything of that pattern, you know it's valid. So I just want to put up some of these just to keep in mind so that it might be more, these might be things you come across. And as soon as you recognize that these are things, you can then know, oh, it follows this format. It's a valid argument.
Wait, sorry. Did you say that was not valid?
It was not valid. It's
Oh,
not.
because I thought it had to have a truth in it in the first thing.
So here's this is a really good point for bringing this up. So validity is, what's the best way of putting it. Validity is like a recipe. It's got nothing, like a recipe can, whether a recipe is good or not, has nothing to do with whether the food you put in and use in that recipe is good. Like, I can use the best, like whether or not some Michelin star chef gave me a good recipe has nothing to do with where I got my ingredients. Whether he's got a good recipe or not entirely has to do with, if I begin with decent ingredients, we get a good outcome. So in the same way, an argument is valid or not determined not by whether the premises are true, but by, if I begin with true premises, do I get a true conclusion? So it's got nothing to do with whether, as a matter of fact, the premises are true. What it has to do with is, if they're true, if I start with good premises, then the conclusion has to follow. So the way you check if a deductive argument is good or is valid is you begin by assuming that the premises are true, and then see, even if it were the case that those were true, would it be possible for it to be false, for the conclusion to be false? So in this case, I can go with myself, is it possible that I'm not a dog, even if I have teeth and all dogs have teeth? And you think like, well, yeah, there are a lot of animals that have teeth and aren't dogs. So every one of those animals is a counterexample that would prove that even if all dogs have teeth and even if I have teeth, I'm not necessarily a dog. So this is a case in which A and B are both true, but the conclusion is false. So that's what validity is about. It's about, if you begin good, will you end up good? And the reason this is important is because in our everyday life, the goal is to take things we know are true, then reason well to get to a good conclusion. So the form in these cases is the important bit. And we're going to be talking about this a lot this semester, but that's the general idea about validity. It's about a way of assessing something in the same way you'd assess the quality of a recipe. You don't assess the recipe based on whether you use crappy ingredients. You assess it on its own merits. And whether you assess it on its own merits by looking at cases in which you have good ingredients and it still comes out good. If a recipe gives you bad food, even if you use top class ingredients, that's how you know it's a bad recipe. So did that make sense at all? Megan, was that helpful at all?
Yeah, I think so. I think I just need to do this more. I thought it was like very clear. And then when I was doing the homework, I was not having as easy of a time as I thought.
Yeah, and so I'm glad that yeah, we can practice this more, and we'll be going over them again these classes, but validity is definitely one which can be a little tough to wrap your head around. But yes.
So validity just goes for deductive arguments?
Correct.
Not for inductive?
Correct. Validity is the way that you judge a good deductive argument. So cogent is the word we use for a good inductive argument, and all that means is you have a large background base. Valid is what you use for a deductive argument, and that's just a good argument will be valid if it's deductive. So yes, spot on. All right, so some other ones that are just useful to keep your eyes on for good valid arguments, where if you see something of this form, you know that no matter what goes in there, it's guaranteed to be valid. And this is why arguments are so powerful, because they have a form which is common to many different ones. And so, for instance, if you see something in the form, if blank, then blank, and you see, so if blank 1, then blank 2, and then you see blank 1, you know that blank, and then you see blank 2, this is going to be valid. So what do I mean here? Well, anything you put in the blanks is going to make for a true conclusion. So if I say, if I'm tall, then I am over 7 feet. Then you say, I'm tall, then if this is true and this is true, guaranteed to be true that I'm over 7 feet. So this is one form, this if A, then B, A, B. Anytime you see anything of this form, it's going to be valid. Now that's not a guarantee that this is going to be true. It could be the case that someone would come along and say, no, you don't have to be over 7 feet to be tall. Anyone who's over 6 feet is tall. And so we can disagree about whether the premises are true. But if someone's willing to grant this is true and this is true, then it has to be true that that you're over whatever number we have here. So anytime you see something in the form, if A then B, premise 1 and premise 2, then you have a conclusion of B. That's always going to be valid. That's just a useful thing to know. Another one that's the case is if, and by A and B here, I just mean put in anything you want. It's a variable like in mathematics. Anything you put here for A, as long as it's the same thing that you have in line 2, and whatever you put here for B, no matter what it is in the conclusion, it's guaranteed that B will be true if premise 1 and premise 2 are true. So the conclusion is guaranteed to be true if premise 1 and premise 2 are true, and these are the form of the premise. Another one is either A is true or B is true, but B isn't true. Therefore, conclusion, A has to be true. And so again, this is the way of which, like, if I tell you I like pizza or I like ice cream, but I don't like pizza, then you know that I have to like ice cream based on what I've said, or I'm lying to you. If I'm telling you the truth and I do either like pizza or ice cream, and I don't like whichever one I said, pizza, then you know I like ice cream. So again, this is another form. So anytime you see someone say either A or B, but not A, you can conclude B. Or but not B, then you can conclude A. These aren't things that are going to be like, I'm not going to ask you what these are particularly, but these are just useful things because you're going to come across some of them in homeworks. And very often you'll see people use these in things you read outside of this class. It's just useful what some of these general valid argument formats are. And I might come back to this later in the semester just because it's a useful skill to have. But does everyone understand then and why you know that these are valid? Well, can you, let's see. Either I am human or I'm a robot. I'm not a robot. Conclusion, I'm human. So the way you test to see whether something's valid, as I said, is you think, imagine it's like an exercise in like imagination. You ask yourself, all right, I'm gonna think of a world in which I'm either a human or I'm a robot, and I'm not sure which. And then I find out through doing some science experiments that I'm not a robot. Is there a world in which I'm not a human in this case? If I already have established through testing that I'm either a human or a robot, and then I go on to find that I'm not a robot, well, no, there's no way for it to be possible that I'm anything other than human because I've already established these two. Now, maybe I made a mistake, and actually I could either be a human or a robot or a zombie. And in that case, one wouldn't be true. But if we accept that one is true and two is true, then I'm guaranteed to be a human.
Sorry,
okay.
so is that deductive because you're starting with a theory and then you're going down from
Exactly.
there? Okay.
Yes, that would be deductive. So if I were to instead say something along the lines of, I asked one person if I was a human and they said I was, and then I asked another person and they said I was, and I asked another person and everyone says I'm a human, so I'm probably a human, that's more inductive. Or even better, if I were to do a test by like, I went to the DNA, I got a 23andMe test and it said I have 23 chromosomes and I'm human, but I don't trust them, I'm gonna try again. And you do it 1,000 times and every time 23andMe tells you that you're human, that would be an inductive way of coming to the conclusion that you're human. But if you, this one of like, another way to think of deductive is it very often starts with very universal statements of like either this, or all things are this way, no things are this way. This is a fact, this is a fact. Well, with inductive, it's generally on a case by case basis. Usually this one and this one and this one. But yeah, so number 3 was deductive. So back to the homework. Number 3 was deductive, but it was not valid. And it was not valid because it is possible for something to have teeth. And even if all dogs have teeth, for you not to be a dog. Number 4 is deductive as well. It's very similar to the last one, but this one is valid. And this one's valid because if you know all dogs have noses and Frank is a dog, it would have to be the case that Frank has a nose. Now, again, maybe it's not true that all dogs have noses. It might very well actually, as a matter of fact, be the case that there are some dogs that lost their nose, like they you know, walked in front of a car and it ran over just their nose. Now, in that case, this wouldn't be a sound argument. And remember, sound means it's both valid and the premises are true. But it's still a valid argument because if all dogs had noses and Frank were a dog, Frank would have to have a nose. Does that make sense to everyone? All right. Then on to number 5. If I take photos with bomb lighting, I end up with a man on the Minnesota Vikings. I took photos with bomb lighting. Therefore, I will end up with a man on the Minnesota Vikings. Is this inductive or deductive?
Deductive.
It is deductive. It is a deductive one. Now, this one threw a lot of people because it has this if in the front phase. So I want to go back to this particular case from above that I talked about with, it is possible to have an if statement as a premise in an argument. And very often you will come across arguments with this form. So it's if A, then B, A, and then B. So this is the form that this argument had. It says, if I take the photos with the bomb lighting, then I will end up with a man on the Minnesota Vikings. I did take those photos. So if this one were true and this one were true, this would have to be true. So what it means for an if statement to be true, all it means is that if this happens, then this always follows. So to say that if this, then this is just to say, if I were to do this, not to say I'm going to, but if it happened, this other thing is guaranteed to happen. So for instance, here's an if statement that's true. If I drop this, it will fall. That's true. And it's true. It's not a guarantee that I do drop it. If I drop it, it will fall. So what would it take for that to be false? What would have to happen to show that this is false? In the case of if I drop this, it will fall. Well, if I were to let go and it were to start hovering about here, that would be a case in which this isn't true. It's not true that if I drop it, it will fall. So to say it's true is just saying if A happens, if in this case I let go of it, it will fall. Or if this person takes the photos with the bomb lighting, then they're guaranteed, or it's 100% certain that they are then going to end up with someone on the Minnesota Vikings. And if that's the case, that anyone who ever takes photos with bomb lighting ends up with someone on the Minnesota Vikings. So therefore, if that's true, it's going to follow that if I take those photos, I will end up with someone. So this is another valid deductive argument. Any questions on this one?
I have a question. That was tricky for me because I had deductive and not valid because, like, what's the guarantee that you will end up with someone on the Minnesota Vikings? Like, we know that if you drop the marker, it's going to fall. We know that, but.
So this is another really good case where, and this one's really tough in terms of, I think what you're pointing out here is that as a matter of fact, this is a false premise. This up here of if you take the photos with a bomb lighting, you'll end up with someone on the Minnesota Vikings. There have been millions of photos taken out there with bomb lighting by people who did not end up with someone on the Minnesota Vikings. However, if it were the case, like if we already accepted as true that every photo that anyone ever took with bomb lighting ended up with someone on the Minnesota Vikings, then it would have to follow. So it is valid. It's just, it's not sound because this is almost certainly not true. So this is a tricky one. And one of the ways in which like logic teachers try to trick people is by including premises which aren't believable. And the reason why it's so important to talk about validity is very often people confuse an argument having true premises and a believable conclusion with it being a valid argument. So for instance, if I tell you like a very common one that people will say is, this is not a valid argument, what I'm about to show you. If A, then B, B, if A, then B, B, therefore A. So if this is not a valid argument, because just because something ends up happening doesn't mean that A was the cause of it. So if I tell you something like, if I have a heart attack, I will die, I died, therefore I had a heart attack. That's not actually a valid argument. Why? Well, I could have gotten shot. I could have gotten hit by a bus. There are many different reasons. But this sort of argument can be very tricky because what will end up happening is people see like, oh yeah, that's true. That's definitely true. And oh yes, that person did die. So it's very tempting to think because the premises are believable or true, that therefore they have to show the conclusion. So what this bomb lighting one shows is always keep in mind that whether an argument is valid and whether it's a good argument comes apart from whether the premises are actually true. And someone can tell you, and what really good persuasive politicians will often do is do things like this. So this is a case in which someone, like, people run this sort of bad argument all the time. So if you watch like a political debate, you'll often see someone say, well, if economics have gone, if it were the case that if we sell jobs overseas, then we'll have less jobs. And actually, let me think if I can come up with a good one. If you don't wear masks, then COVID will go up. COVID went up, therefore no, that's not a good one either. It's really hard to think of these crappy arguments sometimes, but let's see. I'm trying to think of one that a politician might say. Okay, here's one. Oh, no, I just lost it. I'm gonna get a good one here just to help prove this point.
Can you say like, if you vote for me, taxes will go down, taxes went down.
Therefore you voted for me. But
Yeah.
a better one would be something along the lines of, if the robots take over all our jobs, then no one will be employed. No one's employed, that's proof that the robots took our jobs. Well, that's not necessarily the case. Maybe we lost jobs because the environment has changed. Or like, here's another one. If there's a super secret, this is actually a good one. So the QAnon conspiracy theory. If it were the case that there was a super secret dark state that controls everything, then I would probably lose my job because I'm not friends with them. I lost my job. That's proof that QAnon is real and there's people in dark coats. That's not a good argument. It would be a good argument where if you switched these, then it would be a good argument. If you could prove that QAnon, like the anonymous group that controls everything, was real, then you'd have reason to think they took your job. But the mere fact that you lost your job in no way implies that they took it from you. And so in a lot of conspiracy theories, and we're going to come back to this later in the semester, a lot of conspiracy theories get off the ground because people are running these bad arguments and are confusing believable or premises they like with a valid argument. So in the same way, you can have a valid argument with bad premises or good premises and a bad argument, which leads people to draw conclusions that they shouldn't draw. All right, so that one, the next one, where are we doing? We run until 7:05. All right, so I want to just jump through these. I'm just going to say what the answers are for these because we're taking a bit of time on this, and I want to make sure that I can give you everything that I wanted to cover today. So the next one, I've met at least 1,000 people who have taken photos with bomb lighting. Each and every one of them now has a man on the Minnesota Vikings. So if you take photos with bomb lighting, you end up with a man on the Minnesota Vikings. That's inductive and cogent. Again, it's probably not I don't know if it's probably not true that this would ever happen, but if somebody had met 1 million people and this were true, yada, yada. 7, if she hears the lyrics, she'll pity the men I know. She heard the lyrics, therefore she pities the men I know. Deductive and valid, and for the exact same reasons that the photos with bomb lighting. 5, it's the same argument form, valid in the same way. 8, this one was inductive because it's based on 99 individual duels where one guy fights another guy. And then I took either cogent or uncogent for this one. And I think what this shows is that it really depends on how you think of duels. Like if you think that the fact that he's fought 99 people, it could just be a bunch of like chumps that he beat up on. And now he's got to go up against like Arnold Schwarzenegger. Now he's totally screwed. So I let you go either way. I was thinking of it as cogent, but you could go either way. So that one was fine. 77 years ago, this was not an argument. This is just the start of the Gettysburg Address. It's just a statement by Lincoln to talk to people. So it was not an argument. Now, number 10 is an interesting one. And I took basically, if you gave me an answer for number 10, you got credit. Technically speaking, I don't think you could argue that it's inductive. I think rather what it's showing, and I think what a lot of you who said it was inductive are picking up on, is something we're going to talk about in about 10 minutes, which is the way that inductive and deductive arguments can combine together into really complicated arguments. So I think some of the background, the premises, are supported by inductive cases. But so I gave everyone credit for inductive, but strictly speaking, I think you can either interpret this as not an argument, where it's just Jay-Z describing an event he had, or you can see it as a deductive argument in which he's explaining why, if you get pulled over by the police, in his circumstances, you should either, you should come to the conclusion that you pull over to the side of the road instead of trying to start a high-speed chase. And his reasoning behind it is, I mean, you've got, when a cop pulls up behind you, you've got two choices. You can either pull over or try to get away. And his conclusion is, oh, I don't really want to start a high-speed chase. That seems like a bad idea. Plus, on top of that, I've got the money to pay for a lawyer if something happens here. Therefore, the correct thing to do for me in this circumstance is to pull over to the side of the road. So if you're thinking of it in a deductive argument, the premises would be, you've got two choices. I'm not trying to have a high-speed chase, or if high-speed chase is a bad choice. Plus, I've got some money on the side. Therefore, the correct answer is the correct answer is to pull over. So that's how it would be a deductive. Jessica, number 7 is a deductive argument, and it is valid. All right. So as I said, I was happy with how everyone did. On the whole, very good. Again, we're going to be doing this more and more. And again, I honestly, I think I said this earlier, whether you get all the questions right or anything like that, it doesn't bother me as much as that we're learning and getting better at these skills. And I saw, like, so as a matter of fact, like, the biggest thing I was happy about is in week 1, people had some trouble telling the difference between premises and conclusions. But in the week 2 homework, basically everyone got at least half credit on their questions, because just about everyone was able to tell the difference between a premise and a conclusion in it. Some people had trouble whether it was in an inductive or deductive, but just about all of you were able to say when it was, which were the premises and which were the conclusions in it. So on the whole, I'm very happy with how things are going so far. You can give yourselves a pat on the back or whatever you want to do. All right. So now what I want to do is turn to more complicated arguments, because in most of your life, remember, the goal of arguing or reasoning or anything like that is to get to good conclusions. And most of the time you come across these things, they're not simple, like 2 premises and a conclusion. It's going to be steps upon steps, and it'll be like an entire article long, or it'll be like, think about, like, we've all seen this happen. 2 guys are at a bar, and almost always men in this case, and they're having an argument about sports. And this like literally yelling at each other. But this argument about sports will be something like, who's going to win the Super Bowl this year? And this thing can go on for hours. And they're going to bring in all sorts of different evidence of this team has this player and this team has this player. And no, that guy sucks and yada yada. And so it's going to go back and forth, and it's going to be very complicated and nuanced. And they're going to start talking about who scores more points, but who's got better defense. That's a more complicated argument, which is going to take parts of inductive, parts of deductive. And if you're doing it well, it's going to include valid deductive arguments and good cogent inductive arguments. And when you see 2 people arguing about sports at a bar, all they're doing is attempting to convince the other one by, if they're doing it well, using good reasoning and good arguments. So what I want to talk about is, how do you take these little tiny inductive and deductive bits and turn them into bigger arguments? And there's basically 2 different ways of doing this. And both of them involve multiple premises. And that's really what you can think of in terms of a complicated argument. It's about you still only have one ultimate conclusion you're going for. And then the way you get there, or the way that an argument gets more complicated, is there's more premises leading to it. And you can think of it like a house with, like an apartment building. To get to the roof, you have to go through the 5th floor to the 4th floor, and the 4th floor rests on the 3rd floor, and the 3rd floor rests on the 2nd. So in the same way, you have your ultimate conclusion you're trying to prove, and you have many ways and many different premises which are going to support it. And there's 2 different ways that these premises can apply. And I'm just going to put the words over here and then I'll come back to them. The two different ways are convergent, again, stupidly long words, and serial. All these mean is convergent means multiple premises which are coming together from separate directions, all of which support the same conclusion. And then a serial one is where they come one after another. So serial is not in the sense of like nom nom nom, I love Captain Crunch, but in the sense of like a serial killer who kills one person and then kills another person and then kills another person. Or it's related to the word series here. So what's a World Series? It's a whole bunch of games in a row. So what's a serial? Well, it's something that happens one after the other after the other. So what does a complex argument look like? What does an argument that has convergent premises look like? Well, here's something I might say. Here's a conclusion I might want to support. My dog is the best. That's the conclusion I ultimately want to prove to you. I might want to say my dog is the best. And now one way I could do this is say, he's so cute. That's my premise for why my dog is the best. And one thing you might do is disagree with me that he's so cute. You might say, no, that's not true. But if I tell you he's cute, you might be like, all right, he's really cute, but does that really show he's the best dog? Well, I might go, all right, let me give you a separate reason to also think that he's the best dog. Not only is he cute, he's also, he always waits by the door and gives me a kiss. Well, now these are two separate reasons or two separate premises to believe that my dog is the best. And then you might be, all right, but many dogs wait by the door and give people kisses, and many dogs are super cute. And then I say, all right, but also he only sometimes pees on the floor. So each of these premises are designed to together be taken as more evidence to show that my dog is the best. And the basic idea, and these are what are called convergent premises. Convergent premises are just multiple premises, all of which support a conclusion. So the basic idea behind using convergent premises is if you want someone to believe something, just give them more and more and more reasons to do it. If I were to try to convince, like, think of what a used car salesman tries to do. You walk in, what's a used car salesman, whenever you go in there, I've never actually bought a car, but I've seen people do it on TV, so I think I'm an expert. So if you walk in, what the used car salesman tries to do is they always go something like, all right, so what other cars are you thinking about? You're here at the Toyota, you're thinking about a Toyota. What else are you thinking about? And you'll be like, I'm thinking about the Ford. And they'll be like, oh, that Ford is crap. Let me tell you all the ways in which the Toyota is better. It's cheaper. It's more reliable. It's more, it's much prettier. You can get it in blue, which I know is your favorite color. I'm willing to give you this deal. And what they're doing is just giving you a whole bunch of different independent reasons to believe the conclusion. And so this is one way to make an argument stronger, is just add more premises, each of which supports the conclusion. Megan, do you have a question?
Yeah, so convergent happens simultaneously and serial is like chronological.
Exactly. And we're going to talk about serial in a second. And it's basically, the nature of speaking means that you can't actually say three things at once. But the way to think of it is they converge and they all support simultaneously. You don't have to prove that he's cute to then prove that he always waits for you for a kiss. You don't have to prove he's cute to show that he only sometimes pees on the floor. These are all independent, and so they are logically, they don't support each other. While serial, which is what we're about to talk to, are ones in which it's almost like, you know, in Monopoly, to get, you have to pass go to get to the first line, or if you go to jail, you can't keep going. Jail holds you there. In this way, you have to roll this before you're allowed to do some other thing. That was a terrible analogy, but general idea is like, if you wanted to go to Albany from New York, from Manhattan, you'd first have to go through the Bronx. So you first get to the Bronx, and then from the Bronx, you get to Westchester and yada. So that's serial. Is to do one, you first have to do the other one. In these cases, they're totally separate from each other. It's all about my dog is the best, and I'm going to give you 17 different reasons for it. Very often in the imaginary bar sports argument, you'll hear somebody be like, no, the Giants are way better than the Jets this year. They've got a better defense. They've got a better quarterback. They've got a better this. And each one of those is meant to independently support the claim that the Giants are better than the Jets or something along those lines. So you can think of it, and this is something which the online reading did, which is, and I'm going to give people the option, I'll write it in the homework instructions, but it is very useful to think about arguments in terms of pictures like this, like coming up with a little diagram. So if you think of your conclusion here, each one of these convergent premises will be like a separate thing working towards that conclusion. And they don't touch each other, they all just work here. Now what a serial conclusion is this one supports this one, and this one supports your main overall conclusion. So you can kind of think of this as this is like a full-on first level premise. This is like this is a somewhat conclusion. It's like a tentative conclusion. So you can think of this one as your premise, and this is your sub-premise, because this is the premise of your premise, which will then prove the conclusion. Now, this is going to make more sense with an example. So if I tell you, so imagine this used car salesman again. He tells you, buy this Toyota. That's the conclusion he wants you to draw. And then one of the reasons he might give for this is it's more reliable than the Ford. Now, at this moment, what's a question you might ask? If you were actually buying this car, what might you ask at this point?
What makes it more reliable than the Ford?
Yeah, you're going to ask, what is your proof that this is more reliable than the Ford? How do I know you're not just making it up? And he's going to say something like, well, on average, Toyotas have to go to the shop for repairs once every 5 years, but the best evidence is that Fords have to go once every 2 years. So what he's doing is giving you a reason to accept this premise. So he'll generally give you something like data says that blah, blah, blah. Or another one he might say is, on average, each year, Toyota owners spend $5,000 on repairs, but Ford or every 10 years, they spend an average of $5,000, but Ford owners spend an average of $10,000. Therefore, this is proof that the Toyota is more reliable. So this is a serial set of premises. The data doesn't matter except insofar as it supports that the Ford is more reliable. And once you accept that the Ford is more reliable, that gives you the Toyota is more reliable. Once you have reason that the Toyota is more reliable, you have reason to buy the Toyota. So it's this data proves this, and this proves this. And another one could be the Toyota is cheaper. Toyota costs less. And you might be like, well, what's your evidence that it costs less? And then he might go, MSRP for the Toyota is 10K and the Ford is 20K. So what I just did here is showed a way in which convergent and serial arguments can be combined. So here are two separate convergent premises for the conclusion by this Toyota. The Toyota costs less and the Toyota is more reliable. And then each of these convergent premises, which directly support this, have sub-premises or lower premises that support themselves. So this argument is really, if you were to see this written out on a paragraph, it would be something like, you should buy this Toyota. The Toyota costs less than the Ford. The Ford costs blah, 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 and the Toyota costs blah, blah, blah. Furthermore, the Toyota is more reliable than the Ford. Studies have shown that on average, each owner of a Toyota spends X thousand numbers of dollars a year or hundreds of dollars a year on repairs, while Ford owners spend $1,000 a year. And so while it's written as 5 sentences, you can kind of parse out, oh, what this person's trying to get me to do is buy this Toyota. And their main reasons for doing that is it costs less. And here's proof that it costs less. It costs less. Look at the value that you're going to have to pay for it. And here's other reason to buy the Toyota. It's more reliable. And how do I know? Here's the data. So another one in which you can see these coming together are political elections. Here's one which many of us are going to be asking ourselves in a few months' time. Should I vote for Trump or should I vote for Biden? And it's not just like when people are deciding who to vote for, they don't just have one reason to vote for them. It's not just like, I saw Donald Trump once. That's full story. It's rather like Trump's economic policies, Trump's political policies, his international relations issues, his ability to lead. All of these are going to be taken into account. So you might, if you're somebody who's like, the conclusion you might draw when you're going to the voting booth is something like, I should vote for Biden. And then you might have premises, like you'll have a bunch of different convergent premises leading to this. One might be, he didn't lie about COVID. His economic views are better. Anything else? And so each of these then you would in your own mind support. You'd be like, okay, his economic views are better. What do we mean by that? And you'd think, well, his tax views are X, Y, and Z. And that's the X, Y, Z. These are all converge upon this premise. These are all serial premises that together as a convergence prove this one, which then is a convergent premise with this one, all reasoning why you should vote for Biden. So this is really just a very fancy way of showing in a diagram form the sort of stuff that you're doing all the time. If you want to convince someone of something, you have to give them many different reasons that you should be believed. And then on top of that, you're going to want to give them evidence that those reasons for believing it are good ones. So that's all that these multi-step arguments are. And really all arguments you're going to encounter in your everyday life are going to be these complex multi-step ones. So for instance, like think about ads. When you see a beautiful person wearing some clothing item, there along here, it's like, that person is beautiful. Well, what's the evidence for that? Well, they look nice, or I should buy this clothing item is the conclusion. What's your evidence for it? That person looks beautiful and is wearing that clothing item. What's your evidence that that's a good reason? Well, in the same sort of way, it's all just arguments, arguments, arguments in your everyday life. Your friend says you should buy a cat. You say, why? They say, cats are way easier to take care of than dogs. You say, what's your evidence for it? They say you don't have to take them out. You don't have to give them baths. You don't have to spend as much on food because they eat less. All of these are converging on the fact that cats are easier than dogs, all of which is trying to prove you should buy a cat. So that's all this stuff is. And so does this make sense? Just the way in which we can combine this stuff from last time. One last thing worth saying on this point is that, and this is what's really, this is one of the things which makes it hard to identify which is an inductive and a deductive, because in these complex sorts of arguments, sometimes you have a deductive argument. So something along the lines of all mammals have fur. So that's premise 1. Premise 2 is I'm a mammal. Conclusion, I have fur/hair. I guess we call it hair on people. Now, in this case, you can think of this laid out right now. It's a very straightforward, simple deductive argument. But this premise up here, number 1, is something which you might want evidence for. You might say, what's your proof that all mammals have fur? And what you might say is something along the lines of, every mammal that any scientist has ever looked at had fur. So then you'd say, oh, this premise here, actually in the background, something we're not talking about, is this sub-premise, which is actually an inductive one. So this right here is deductive by itself, but in the background, there's this inductive. And so I think one of the things with the Jay-Z song line is one of the ways that people come to the conclusion that you only have two choices when you get pulled over by the cops is that it's an inductive set of reasoning. Other people in life, like as a matter of fact, no one has ever just teleported away when they get pulled over. So in that sense, that argument was a deductive argument with an inductive supporting premise in the background. So that is one way, and why this stuff gets a little more complicated and why it's useful to tackle this stuff. So in the homework, it's going to be a lot of like, find the main premises, find the other ones. Hopefully it won't be too complicated, but this is something that is hard to do. And like, I still very much struggle at identifying, I've been doing this for years and years, and even the best like thinkers are still like, I still buy crap online I shouldn't buy. And why? It's because I don't always recognize all the inductive arguments. I don't realize the ways in which I'm being manipulated, yada, yada, yada. So this stuff is going to be hard, but it's good to practice. And you are never going to be perfect at this, but the more you practice on it, the better you will be at not, like, if there's one thing I want you to take away from this class, I want there to be one item that you see online and think is nice, and you manage to convince yourself not to buy. And you end up the next day going, yeah, that's pretty good. I didn't buy that $500 pair of sandals I didn't need. So that's one of the goals. So again, we're gonna be practicing this all semester, but that's the general idea of what multi-step arguments are. We've got 10 minutes left, and I just want to quickly talk about one other thing which is useful to talk about, and that's this notion of a hidden premise. And I bring this up, this is something else we'll be talking about all semester. So if you don't fully understand it right now, that's okay. It's on the homework, but I'll be grading these ones really easy because we're not spending a ton of time on them. But basically the idea behind a hidden premise is life is short and we don't say everything we think all the time. And if I know something and you know something, we don't bother saying it because it's like common knowledge. Like if we're having a discussion about whether the president's a good guy or not, we don't bother spending the first 10 minutes discussing who the president is because we all know Donald Trump is the president. Now, if you had somebody who came from another country, then you might be like, let me explain to you who our president is and what the president is before I do anything else. But very often there's this common background stuff that doesn't get talked about. And very often stuff in this background is drawn upon when we're making arguments. So even if we don't say it out loud, this background belief might serve as kind of a hidden premise that is actually playing a very important role in our reaching the conclusion we're reaching. And so here's one in which there's a hidden premise. And the reason hidden premises are important is very often an argument is only valid if you recognize that there's a hidden premise there. So for instance, I'm not worried about validity or anything like this. This is just, is this a good bit of like intuitive everyday reasoning? You should buy the monthly Metro card. That's your conclusion. And what's your premise? It will save you money in the long run. So this is an argument somebody might tell you. They might say, you might be going, should I buy like the monthly Metro card? I'm not sure, I just moved to the city. Should I buy it? This person's gonna say, it will save you a lot of money in the long run. Yes, you should buy it. Now there's a hidden premise in here. So you might overhear this conversation and you might hear this one person talking to the other person and be like, oh, they said it's gonna save that person a lot of money, so it's probably gonna save me a lot of money too. What's the hidden premise, which these people aren't talking about, but if you don't recognize it's there, you might end up buying a Metro card you shouldn't buy. So what's the hidden premise here? Anyone know? When is it a good idea to buy a monthly Metro card? The one where you pay one big price up front.
How often you take the train?
It's entirely based on how often you take the train. It's only going to save you a lot of money if you ride the train a lot. If you ride the train once a month, it's a terrible investment. You're paying $130 for a Metro ride. If, however, you ride it 10 times a day, it's a great investment because otherwise you're paying like $2.50 per ride times 10. So you're paying $25 a day for a month. So it all comes down to the hidden premise here. So this is what you hear out loud, but in the background, the hidden premise is you ride the subway a lot. So this is what a hidden premise is, which is something which is very often like in the background. So if you and I were having this conversation, you'd probably know about how often I rode the subway because I'd probably have told you a sentence before. I ride the subway 3 times a day. Does this make sense as an investment? And you're going to tell me, yes, it will save you money in the long run. But that's because in the background, you know I ride the subway a lot. If I'm somebody who doesn't realize that this is an important hidden premise, so like a tourist might just overhear this and be like, they said I should buy the monthly Metro card. It'll save me a lot of money. Well, this tourist doesn't realize it's only going to save you money if you ride the subway a lot. So that's what we're talking about with hidden premises and why they're so important. Other hidden premises. So like, think about like an Instagram ad of like an Instagram model wearing some cute new outfit and your friend is like, I'm going to buy that outfit. And you're like, why? You're like, well, they look cute in it. I want clothes that look cute. Therefore, I should buy it for me. Well, what's the issue with this? Well, that person in that picture is a model. Like that person usually anyone who's modeling is going to look good. Like they look good in a plastic bag taken out of the trash. I am not ripped like a model. Therefore, I only look good in certain types of clothes. So the fact that that person looks good is not a reason for me to buy it. The hidden premise here is that person is really, really good looking. So if a person is really, really good looking, it really doesn't matter what you put them in. And this is why they try to make this is why models are attractive. Like clothing models are attractive because you look at it and you fail to realize like the reason this person looks good has nothing to do with the clothes they're wearing. It entirely has to do with what they look like. So this is another way in which hidden premises are important to look at is things like, you know, why is this happening? Keep your eye, and this is something we'll be talking the whole semester, keep your eye on why something is the case. What hidden premises might be in there that you aren't realizing? And because you aren't realizing those, what seems like it might be a good argument is actually somewhat problematic or flawed. So if you conclude that you should buy that clothing because somebody else looks good in it, well, you're different. Like that person is just good looking to begin with. There's the hidden fact that they're good looking. Don't let that confuse you. If somebody is telling you like, you know, healthcare, this is going to save the average American. Like here's an actual one. When you often hear about tax breaks, they will very often say things like the average American will save $1,000 a year on taxes. But if you actually look at it, the way averages work, you divide over the whole population. So it can be true that the average person will save $1,000, but in truth, it's just Jeff Bezos saved $24 billion that year. And so if you divide the entire American population by Jeff Bezos's savings, that's a way in which like you might think the reason that the taxes, like I'm going to get a tax break. And then you look and you're like, why am I paying more taxes this year? They told me there'd be a tax break for the average American. Well, in a sense, they were right. It is the average American will pay less taxes because Jeff Bezos single-handedly is pulling down the average because he's so wealthy. So that's all I want to say about hidden premises. The basic idea is when you're looking for a hidden premise, think about the thing that's in the background, which someone is assuming, and they don't feel the need to say it out loud, but they're assuming that it's the case and are using that thing they're assuming to prove their point. And so these are very useful because very often we don't say these hidden premises because if you bring a premise out into the open, the argument becomes a lot less persuasive. So we try to hide, hidden premises are very sneaky. And one of the main things that like online retailers or anything else is trying to keep the hidden premises hidden so you don't realize that you're being fucked over. So I just want to start in this class talking about what they are, and they're going to come up again and again over the whole semester. So if you didn't fully understand this at the end, don't worry. If you have any questions for the homework, feel free to get in touch. And I think this is where we're going to stop if there are no more questions. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. If anyone wants to have office hours this week, my Thursday is pretty much free. So I am happy to talk to anyone. And other than that, you are all free to go. So have a great rest of your night. And I will talk to everyone this week, and I will see you all next week.
Have a great day.